I'd just like to give everyone a trigger warning for discussions of sexual violence, a mention of rape and child sex abuse, transphobia, and sexual violence apologia. So much sexual violence apologia. So, recently, ContraPoints made a video on counterculture. In her video, she proposed a model. It's a really cool model, and it goes like this. First, someone does a thing. Second, that thing is abstracted. Third, that thing is essentialized. And that's bad. Did you understand that? Yeah, me neither. I'll need to show you an example. The only problem is, all her examples involve James Charles and people accusing James Charles of doing some pretty horrible things. And this video isn't about James Charles, so I don't want to accuse him of doing those things and have the conversation devolve into what James Charles actually did. So for our purposes, we're not going to be talking about James Charles. We're going to talk about completely fictional person, James Charles, who did all the things Contra says people accused him of, okay? So here's how Contra's model goes. James Charles says that he's not fully gay because he's been attracted to trans men. Then that gets abstracted into James Charles made transphobic comments. Then that's essentialized into James Charles is a transphobe. A complex scenario takes place, like someone making a specific comment. Then that complex scenario is abstracted into a simple verb. Instead of telling us what James Charles did, people simply say he made transphobic comments. Then, that verb is essentialized into an adjective or a noun. Instead of saying that James Charles made transphobic comments, they say that he is transphobic or is a transphobe, which implies that the transphobia is an inherent part of his character rather than a choice he made and could make differently. A scenario becomes a verb, becomes an adjective or a noun. This seems reasonable enough, at least on the surface, but let's dig a little deeper. Here, we have some Contra stands unironically telling me that I'm being essentialist for saying James engaged in sexual predation. I used a verb, the abstraction stage, but I'm being accused of essentialism. Why? Well, because someone who engages in sexual predation is a sexual predator. So, even though I'm not saying James is a sexual predator, I'm implying it. But I wasn't trying to imply it, and herein lies a problem. Verbs have counterpart adjectives and nouns. If you swim, you're a swimmer. If you sing, you're a singer. If you steal, you're a thief. And if you prey on someone sexually, you're a sexual predator. And yes, sometimes you can say someone does a thing without implying it's intrinsic. In practice, not everyone who sings is a singer. But everyone who steals is a thief, everyone who murders is a murderer, and everyone who engages in sexual predation is a sexual predator. So it's impossible to label someone's poor behavior without being essentialist. A scenario becomes a verb and an adjective or noun. And before you say it, I know this isn't what Contra intended. I know her criticism of essentialism only applied to someone explicitly saying, this person is the bad thing. But the fact is, it's not just her stands merging the abstraction and essentialism stages of her model. She does this herself in every other one of her examples. One of her examples sees James Charles tried to trick straight men, being both abstracted and essentialized into James Charles is toxic and manipulative, and another example sees it abstracted and essentialized into James Charles is a sexual predator. A scenario becomes a verb and an adjective or noun. It's not until her last example that Contra introduces the two-step model, and yet that's the one people keep evoking. The fact is, once you strip away all the fluff of her trying to be clever, all this model is her demonizing people for replacing a description of someone's behavior with the appropriate verb. James Giles tried to trick straight men into thinking they're gay becomes James Giles engaged in sexual predation. And this is the point where I need to go on a massive tangent because apparently this take is controversial. Fuck my life. ContraPoints doesn't believe that it's sexually predatory to argue with someone about their sexuality in an attempt to convince them that they're attracted to you. She presents two arguments. The first is that, quote, "When I think of a sexual predator, I think of a rapist, or a child molester, or maybe an abusive boss," unquote. What this tells me is that Contra doesn't understand how sexual violence works. I'm shocked. Truly I am. The fact is, anyone can be a sexual predator. Your boss, your friend, your sibling, your parent, your significant other, your doctor. Literally anyone in even the slightest position of power can be a sexual predator, and anyone who's not in a position of power can still want to be. And I'll let you in on a secret, Contra. A sexually frustrated young man isn't exactly low on the list of potential sexual predators. Shocking, I know. Her second excuse is that you can't trick someone about their sexuality. Yep, Contra definitely doesn't understand how sexual violence works. Apparently, the idea of pressuring someone is completely new to her. What Contra's doing here is minimizing and excusing sexual violence, and that's fucking disgusting, and more than enough reason to justify ejecting her from society, never mind cancelling her. But unfortunately, there's just not enough time to dwell on that, because we have other issues to discuss. The fact is, what James did is sexually predatory, and we all know that. We've seen this behaviour a million times before. It's just, usually, when we hear about it, it's straight men trying to trick lesbians. But the genders or sexualities of the people involved doesn't change the fact that the number one rule of consent is that no means no, and I'm gay or I'm straight is about the most clear-cut no anyone is ever going to get. James Giles is a sexual predator. That is just a fact. And with that out of the way, we can get to the core of Contra's problem. All Contra is taking issue with here is people accurately labeling other people's behavior. And I can understand that to an extent. These labels can be vague and can result in misunderstandings, especially when it comes to very, very broad terms like sexual predation and transphobia. But what Contra's ignoring here is that you're always free to clarify these terms. It's not like someone says, James Giles is a sexual predator, and that's it, end of story. You can say, what did he do? Or you can research what he did. And if you're an honest person, or even just a curious person, you will. What Contra's complaining about here is just basic communication. We've always done it this way. Always. Labels and summarization and synthesis and shorthand are a part of language and a part of life. And if you're not convinced, don't worry, because your mummy Contra agrees with me. The fact is, she engaged in abstraction herself. Take the sentence, James Giles tried to trick straight men. Well, how did he trick them? What did he try? Rather than tell us what actually happened in all its juicy nuance, Contra's just labeling him a trickster. I can't believe she'd cancel him like this. A scenario is summarized. Because it needs to be summarized. Because even if it were possible to remember an entire scenario in perfect detail. Communicating all that detail and nuance every single time would make the conversation completely unwieldy. This model is completely broken because it's a critique of communication techniques that are so universal that you can't help but use them yourself when explaining the model. And aside from the model being completely broken, there's also one more problem. Since when is this specific to cancel culture? It's not. It's basic communication. Someone does a thing, and we label it. This happens on the left. It happens on the right. It happened before the left-right divide was even a thing. When Contra stands trash talk my video later, they're not going to quote my every word before delivering a meticulous critique. They're just going to say, he lied, or he misunderstood, or his video was a mess. If Contra convinced you that this was particularly a problem for any specific group of people, then congratulations, she tricked you. Look, I'm not saying that there aren't problems with people misrepresenting things, because there are. But aside from internal contradictions, there's no specific model or pattern of speech you can use to identify when someone's doing that. The way you identify it is you fact-check people's claims and see that they're lying. But you're not going to get anywhere by dismissing people for abstraction or essentialism, when, really, they're just communicating the same way we always have.